Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Lunchtime Discovery series brought to you by the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences and the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education. Thanks for being here on this Wednesday, November 4th. Glad that you could join us for today's presentation. We've got a great show for you with a familiar face. I think most folks if you've tuned into Lunchtime Discovery series or any kind of museum programming, then you've seen and heard from museum ornithologist, the research curator for ornithology, Dr. John Gerwin. He's a frequent guest to the Lunchtime Discovery series because every time he comes on the program, we learn something awesome and amazing about birds, other animals. He is a fantastic scientist and a naturalist. John, welcome to the program.
Thanks. Thanks everyone for coming out. I know it's a big day on the news. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen so we can talk about bird migration today. See how this goes. How does that look? Give it a minute to settle in. All right. It always takes a few seconds for my computer to stabilize. How does that look? Did that come across okay?
I'm still seeing the background. Now I'm seeing the presenter view, John.
All right.
Instead of gesture slides.
You know, it does this every time. I have to go down to this.
But don't worry, our crowd here is
there we go.
Excited, patient, and happy to learn about animal movements.
All right, here we go. That should look better.
Looks fabulous.
Fabulous. So I'm going to talk about migration and mostly birds and give some information, some general information about migration, along with some specific information about some projects that I've been involved with and a few colleagues are doing to highlight results of some studies. So this is one of those years where everybody's clamoring for change, but here I'm talking about change of scenery, change of location. That's where the word migration comes from. In the case of birds, it's a change of geography when we're talking about migration. And we're used to seeing migration and talking about migration in the spring or fall here in, at this latitude, say in North Carolina. But, you know, it's happening all the time in some place around the world. And of course, it happens in more than just birds. We're familiar with insects, for example. I'm sure most people are familiar with monarch migration, one of the great wonders of the world, really. But there are other things that migrate too. Some things we may be less familiar with right now. There are these butterflies, the cloudless sulfur, they're winging their way eastward. They head to the coast before they move south. There are some dragonflies that migrate. There's a few bats that are migratory, like this Ori bat, and even a grasshopper that's migratory. When it comes to the bird migrations, again, we're used to thinking of things in the fall moving south. How does that look? Well, some birds from up north will move into North Carolina. They're moving in right now. So, for example, we have white-throated sparrows moving into our region in the last week or so, and they'll spend the winter here. Some of our breeders that were here last month or in September through the summer into September, they've moved out of North Carolina, but they don't go very far. They just go into the southeastern U.S., the hermit thrush, for example, which I'll talk about in a little bit more. They don't migrate very far. We have birds that breed in North Carolina, for example, and I'll show you where one of them went for its winter. Some of the North Carolina birds migrate out of North Carolina and they go into Caribbean islands. That sounds like a nice little place to go for the winter. Others move into Mexico, Central America, like a familiar ruby-throated hummingbird. They migrate to Mexico and Central America. And then there are those that we hear about too that go to South America. So lots of different ways, as you can see on the map, lots of different species doing lots of different migratory patterns. And then something you may not think about much is that birds that are in the southern hemisphere will migrate north, while some of our birds might be heading south. In the south, they might be heading north. So again, different kind of migration patterns. Another way to do a pattern is a directional. So there's seasonal, which is the time, but in terms of directional, here we have two ways of going. Latitudinal is north-south. That's the common one. But there are some birds that move east and west. We have evening grosbeaks, for example, that often move from the northwest to the more easterly direction when they migrate. Others that are mountain inhabiting species move up and down the mountain. They don't go very far in terms of a geographic distance, but they go up and down. They might move several thousand feet lower in elevation during the non-breeding season. Some species migrate in just an oval. Some make a straight line north and south. Some do an oval. Some go in a figure-8 pattern, which is to say, in the fall they go one way in one direction, say northwest to southeast, and then on the spring migration they will come around and fly in another direction, in the opposite directions, and make a figure-8. A lot of seabirds do this over the Atlantic, North and South Atlantic Oceans. Red crossbills are a finch, a species from mostly up north, although they also breed in the mountains of North Carolina, but they're nomadic. We don't really know what to make of their movements. They do these migrations, but they're unpredictable. And then there are species that move out of the north, typically come south during certain years when there's a fewer, for example, fewer seeds. Right now there's a reduced cone crop up north, and so there are pine siskins and red-breasted nuthatches that have moved already into North Carolina as of the last 2 weeks. And these are birds that are not here every year in the non-breeding season, but this is one of those years where it's an eruption. So a lot of the birds, they are birds that come from northern US and Canada and will go further south than they might normally do. So it's something having a direct ecological aspect. And then there's some species that have different populations. So we call them subspecies. We can recognize them morphologically, like the orange crown warbler. And the way they migrate is the populations migrate in specific manners. And in this case, there's a leapfrog pattern, which is to say that there's orange crown warblers that breed in Alaska. They migrate the furthest south of all the populations. So they leap over the other populations and head the furthest south. It's as if they're matching north latitude with south latitude. Whereas the populations that are in between, they migrate less distance. And again, they might be flying over another population to get to where they're going. There are some species that a lot of birds molt before they migrate, but not all of them do it the same way. So some of them will actually migrate a little bit of distance first, then they will molt, then they will continue the migration. A lot of birds disperse, and some disperse in a larger manner, more coordinated, but it's not quite a migration, but it is a big movement. Some species, I like to joke to say that there's some individuals that don't ask for directions. It's not a species thing. It's more some individual birds will make an error and do what we call it a reverse migration. But and sometimes those individual birds, once they've done it once, they will continue to do it year after year. We tracked a few painted buntings down in Mania a few years ago. One bird showed up, and it was a bird we had banded in near Columbia, South Carolina about 3 years earlier. But it showed up in Mania at someone's feeder, and she reported it, and we got the report, and I sent my helper down to check on it, and he confirmed the band number that was on it. And I'll explain that banding more in a little bit, but that bird had some buddies with him, and they continued to come back to her feeder for the next 3 years. So once that bird had locked in, he was going the wrong way. They should migrate south into the Caribbean islands, but instead he went from Columbia, South Carolina to Mania, North Carolina. We're all familiar with the Arctic tern. Many of us are familiar with the Arctic tern. It's that long distance, or we call it the champion migrant, going from the Arctic to the Antarctic. You may not be familiar with some other birds that migrate in similar distances. The barn swallow, common barn swallow, there are some that winter all the way down to the tip of South America, and they are probably the birds, thinking about the leapfrog migration, they're probably the birds that breed up in Alaska. They breed all the way to Alaska, and it's those Alaskan birds are probably the ones going down to Tierra del Fuego, for example. So they're quite the long distance migrant, especially for such a little bird, a little probably 16, 17 gram bird. The little Wilson storm petrel is about the size of a purple martin. They breed in the Antarctic. They fly up to the North Atlantic Ocean, so we see them off North Carolina as a non-breeder during they'll spend 4 or 5 months off of our coast, foraging out over the Gulf Stream. So as I mentioned, some use different routes, and those are just a diagram to show you one species of shorebird called the American golden plover. And this is where they breed, and in the fall, they tend to migrate off, off the east coast of Canada here, New England. They head straight down to South America, but in the spring, when they come back, they will come up this way and come up through the central flyway of the US and Canada. There are a lot of factors involved in why birds do what they do or how they do what they do. So we know that food availability and weather patterns are some proximate cues to move birds along. We don't know all the full interplays between them. Folks are still doing a lot of studies on that. Then there are these internal things, they seem to be genetically programmed to register things like the angle of the sun, the amount of daylight. There are hormonal changes that are cues for the birds. And then there are other tools in, for example, we know there's some iron elements inside the bird's skull, so they seem to be sensitive to the Earth's magnetic field. There are visual cues. They can use landforms. Some will use star patterns, the sun during the day. And studies have been done to show that this is what these birds are doing. Young adults follow geese, so there's a behavioral component to some species migrating in family or related groups, species groups. And then there are different ways that they cover distances. So some species take their time. Chimney swifts don't seem to go very far in a given day. They have a little bit of data on their movements. They tend to take their time flying south, whereas some species have been shown to go up to 600 miles in a day. That's, it's a pretty good clip. A transoceanic flight could mean as much as flying at 100 for 100 hours in one flight. And the way they can do that is a lot of birds go into a state, what we call hyperphagia, which is kind of how I get late at night when I need a bag of potato chips, before going to bed. I'm just get really hungry and I start eating. But what a bird like a hummingbird will do is start feeding on a lot of whatever it can get, nectar or insects, and nearly double its weight in just a few days. And that weight goes into this fat. The fat is what the birds burn when they're doing these long migratory flights. Very efficient. So a lot of songbirds migrate at night, but not all birds do. Like chimney swifts migrate and hummingbirds migrate during the day. And a lot of our warblers, vireos, thrushes, and things are migrating at night. And they have been recorded sort of an average of 2,000 feet altitude, whereas some larger birds, like geese, have been recorded as high as 30,000 feet flying over the Himalayan mountains. All right, so I mentioned that birds are doing things like this molting and doing it differently. So here's some examples. The ruby-throated hummingbird molt is really protracted. It's a bird that it can't afford to drop too many wing feathers at one time, since it's, relying so much not only for migration, but relying on flight for feeding. So what it does is it will begin to molt in late July, and some males begin to leave our area in late July. And then they will continue molting through the migration, get to the wintering grounds, and finish the molt on the wintering grounds. Some birds, a lot of the songbirds around here, will finish their molt prior to migration. Most of the warblers, thrushes, and things finish their molt. Some do not molt until they've migrated. So the flycatchers fly south with their worn feathers, and then they will change their clothes when they get to the wintering grounds. And again, I mentioned that some do this molt migration, where they'll move to another area, begin the molt, and that molt may be a partial molt, it might be a complete molt, and then they will finish their migration and may finish the molt after they get to where they're going. So different complexities. If you are moving around, especially if you're migrating, it is a bit risky. And yet it's interesting that so many birds do it. Obviously, habitat loss is a big factor. For example, when we're doing our capture, mark, and recapture studies, we capture birds in the same net, even during migration. Or, for example, in the winter, I banded a couple of these white-throated sparrows in my backyard. Last year, one came back. This year, another one came back. So it's pretty interesting. This is a bird that most of them breed in Canada, and yet here they come to my backyard year after year. So each habitat patch can matter to a given bird. And there are lots of collisions, a lot of potential collisions. We see them, with lights, glass, turbines, towers of all sorts, of course, with a lot of feral cats. And then problems with potential oil spills and things. And if you have an oil spill right during a migration event, then you wipe out a lot of birds at one time. One thing that happened a few years ago is a larger shorebird called a whimbrel. There've been 2 of them were tagged with some satellite transmitters, and they were transmitting data for over a year as they went back and forth to South America and back up to Virginia and further north. The folks in Virginia were studying these 2 birds, and they were real celebrity birds. And then one fall, one of the signals stopped on Barbados, so they knew that either the transmitter had fallen off or the bird had died. So they went down to look around, and what they discovered, that there was this lingering tradition, local tradition of hunting in the fall, and they historically would have done it for food, but now they didn't really need the food, but they kept doing it, and they were shooting over 10,000 shorebirds every fall, and nobody knew that this was still going on. So they did a lot of education, and they people weren't saying don't hunt at all, just saying, do you really need to hunt that much? That was a lot of pressure, especially these days. And so they were able to reduce the hunting pressure quite a bit, still work with people to allow some hunting and just have more regulations in place. And so although that bird died in a way they didn't want it to, it served a really good purpose there for conservation. Storms are a potential issue. Hurricanes, of course, are going on during the fall season. We've had quite a few this year, and they can certainly impact birds. We've studied a group of Swainson's warblers in coastal South Carolina for years. A lot of them were tagged on this one area. We had about 75 birds banded, color banded. We knew all the individuals. We went back one year after a particularly severe fall season, and all the Swainson's warblers in our study site were unbanded. So we presume that the birds had perished or had been really displaced by some of the hurricanes that had taken place the previous fall when they would have been migrating south. And then there's natural deaths. Not all birds, not all are meant to survive, and a lot of young birds don't make it. There's exhaustion, and that's normal, starvation. About 70% of all first-year birds, those birds that were hatched in the spring, they die before they reach their second year. One interesting aspect of studying migratory birds compared to non-migratory birds is that what we find is that if a bird that's a migratory species lives past its first year, if it's one of the 30% that survives, it will statistically, it's going to live much longer than our resident species. So, for example, those Swainson's warblers that we tracked, I'll show you. I don't think I have that graph in here, but I have another graph that shows that a lot of them lived to 6, 7, 8 years old, and we had a number of them that lived 9 and 10 years old. Whereas the Carolina wrens on our study site, they mostly lived 3 and 4 years old. So how do we figure all this stuff out? Well, historically, it started with what we call banding or ringing, applying these bands to birds. That's sort of the lower tech version. We can also apply these tags on the wings and the necks of birds. And then newer technologies, there's like radar. I'll mention the geolocator and satellite tags and show you data from a GPS tag. An interesting one is this idea of using chemistry, the Earth's, some elements in the Earth's, in the soil. So this is an example of deuterium, which is one of the heavier elements in water. So you've got hydrogen. So you've got these isotopic signatures with water and with hydrogen rather, and carbon and nitrogen. And geologists have mapped them across the globe. So you get patterns like this where it varies by latitude. In the case of carbon and nitrogen, it's even more fine-tuned than this. But for example, if I'm studying a bird in Nicaragua where I do some banding and take feathers from a bird and do an analysis, it may tell me that the nitrogen or carbon isotopic signature is in the green band up here. It tell me that the bird had migrated from somewhere up here. It's a pretty interesting way to do stuff. And it works out this way because here you've got In the case of hydrogen, you got water falling, it's picked up by plants, and you get this isotopic signature in the plant, and the bugs eat the plant. They pick up the signature, then it goes into the bird eats the bug, and as the feathers grow, it picks up the signature. So it can tell you where the feathers were grown. So once you know the molt cycle of a bird, you can work backwards and infer some of the the geographic origin. So some interesting stuff, the interesting ways people have come up with to study bird movements. Here is an animation, if it works. Let's see if it goes. There we go. So it's 118 species of birds that Cornell has data on. You can follow the calendar here. They're migrating north in the spring. Now it's breeding season. It's in the summer. But you can see already some are heading south, even in late summer. A lot of birds head out by late summer. They don't wait till fall. Here it's full fall season, and now we're coming into winter, and the birds have reached their winter area. So it's interesting animation. You can visit Cornell Lab's website and see this. Another site they put together is called Birdcast. So now with weather data and bird data, and merging it and understanding it, you can go to birdcast.org and you can look for a given day. This is 20 May. This is last spring. And this is a prediction saying that they were predicting that there would be some pretty good migration of birds right here through the central Great Plains. So if you were in Nebraska, South Dakota, you might want to have gone out and done some bird watching that morning or the next morning. And you would expect to see some activity. So a lot of bird watchers like to use Birdcast now. They can predict when they might have a good morning. So I'm going to talk a little bit about now these tracking technologies that have come along. This one is called a geolocator. We size these things, based on the size of the bird. We do that for all tags. We're limited to 5% of a bird's body weight. These are solar powered, and the accuracy for these is about 50 miles. And how do we get that accuracy? What these are doing is they're recording data points. What are they recording? They're actually recording the amount of daylight and the date and time. As you know, we can infer where we are by what latitude we're at by the amount of daylight. Here we are in Raleigh, North Carolina, and there's so many minutes in today, and tomorrow there'll be 1 minute less, and then the next day like a minute and a half less. Oh, this is now well known. So when you know what the date and time are, and you know the amount of daylight that was recorded by this device, you get thousands of data points. You can use the software to interpolate. But again, the accuracy isn't real high, but still, if you're talking about a bird migrating to the Southern Hemisphere or even the Central America, I mean, you got some really interesting results. You can learn a lot about the bird's movements, and I'll show you one example in a second. So it is a data recorder, though. That means we have to get the unit in order to get the data. So we have to catch that bird again the next year. This is a GPS tag, and it is also a data logging tag, so I also have to recover it, but it's GPS, so it's higher accuracy. They come in a 1 and a 2 gram size, but they're programmable, which is nice. They're rechargeable. Also means that when I recover it, I can recharge it and reuse it. The downside is that the 1 gram unit can only record 8 points. The 2 gram unit can record 50 points. I'll show you an example of a 1 gram unit we did and got 8 points, but the accuracy is really high. There are tags out that will transmit to cell towers. So they use the GSM technology, and if the bird flies anywhere near a cell tower, it will dump the data, and then the data are sent to our computers, and we know what the bird is up to. And then, of course, satellite transmitters are great when we can put something on a bird, let it go, and it transmits to high accuracy data to the satellites, and we get the data to our computer. One of the really neat developments in the last few years is something called a nanotag here, really small tag. It's like a barcode, but it relies on something called the MODIS radio array, tower array, which is what these blue dots are. These are towers set up. The nanotag sends out a signal, and it beeps to the antenna. So the bird has to fly near an antenna, kind of like a cell tower technology, except that technology, the tags are really big. These are really small, so they can go on songbirds. Developed by some folks in Canada, and in fact, they've used them on monarchs. So here's the current tower array. So the digitally encoded transmitter, and it's sending signals several times a minute, and it's 24/7. So this is the current array of towers across the US and Canada. It's pretty neat. So you can do really small things like large insects. Like I said, I've done dragonflies and monarchs. It's going to really open up our understanding of animal movements at the really small level. There was a Curlin's warbler, which is an endangered species that winters in the Bahamas. And that bird flew up the East Coast, and it just kept pinging signals at the towers all the way up. And they breed in Michigan, so it then flew right across all the array of towers. So they got all this great data on this bird's migratory route that we never could get before. So I'm just going to mention some specifics about these species. I pulled together some different bits of information about their movements. Hummingbird, one of our favorites. One of the things that surprises people to learn is that the oldest breeding males, they depart here by late July. So it's not a fall migration, it's a late summer migration for them. They will begin to molt. They continue that molt during their migration. They will spend several months where they are, maybe Mexico, maybe it's in Nicaragua. And then they finish their molt just prior to return. Sometime in like late February, early March, they will finish the molt, and then they turn around a few weeks later and head back north. But they're spending about half the time south of here or more. So most of them cross the Gulf of Mexico, and that's a 500 to 600 mile flight, depending on where they depart from and where they make landfall. Some of them go around the Gulf, that has been documented, but a lot of them fly straight across the Gulf. And when they do, it's a approximately 24-hour nonstop flight. So it's pretty amazing for this little bird. It will, when it adds all that weight that I talked about before, it'll get up to about 6 grams. Otherwise, they're normally around 4.5. And so they winter in Mexico and Central America. And I put that in quotes because, as I said, they're leaving in July. They may get to Mexico by August, and so they're there. They're actually there in the summer, fall, into the winter, and then they get back here in the spring. And just because you weren't aware, a lot of them will feed from white and blue flowers, not just red. So especially when they're in Mexico and Central America, they spend a lot of time feeding at flowers of different colors, and they eat a lot of arthropods. About half their diet is small arthropods. Banding studies have shown, one of our my colleagues is Susan Campbell. You may have had her visit your yard or seen her post, but she's been banding hummingbirds for a while now. She started when she was working for me part-time, and now on her own, but she's documented returns. She and other hummingbird banders, hummingbirds come back to the same yard at least 7 years in a row. I think she's now maybe up to 9 for a couple of hummingbirds. That's pretty amazing. And I've been involved with some songbird studies, and it shows the same pattern. Migratory birds will come back 6, 7, 8, up to 10 years in a row. If you haven't visited Journey North, I encourage you to do so. They do stuff with like whales and sea turtle migration, as well as the hummingbird. It's a cool site. Some of you know we've been involved in chimney swift monitoring and conservation and education for years, but it's not exactly known where they spend the winter. We know they fly down this way. They cross here the Panama, and they go down the west coast of South America. And our colleagues tell us they show up in coastal Peru in like November. They'll spend November, December, then disappear. Then they show up over here in the Amazon side. But we don't really know a lot about. But so what they seem to be doing is a sort of figure 8 migration. But now with technology, it won't be long before we figure it out. And colleagues have done this for a related species called the black swift. So the black swift breeds here in the West. Here is an isolated group here in Colorado. And they build this kind of nest in waterfalls and more open face rock ledges or shallow caves. So biologists in Colorado caught a few birds, and they put these geolocators on them. And it was kind of cool because they got 3 of them back. And so they were able to show that the birds were flying south about 350 kilometers a day. They flying north, they were a little quicker. And this is where they located their non-breeding area to be in southwestern Brazil. Up until this time, nobody knew for sure where black swifts went during the non-breeding season. We did not, and this was just like 10 years ago that they got this data. So it's pretty amazing to think that, you've got this bird that's, for example, all over this part of southwestern Canada, and we didn't know where they were spending the non-breeding season. So interesting stuff coming along. One of the, I believe that the purple martin was the first species with which we used geolocator. They tested the geolocator technology. I'm pretty sure it was on purple martin. So here's where they breed, and here's where they winter. And you can visit the Purple Martin Conservation Association website to get all kinds of information about purple martins. Here, I pulled a map. One of the fun things that people do is, a lot of people love their purple martins. They have their gourds up. And when the birds come back, you can go to their website. You can go to the Scout Arrival Study webpage on their site, purplemartin.org. You can report your first sighting. And so this is just from last year, all the sightings of adults and subadults arrival, but for the southeast here in the mid-Atlantic. But it's really fun to go in here in North Carolina. They show up in the first week of March, but you can start looking at the site like in early January to see when the first birds show up in the Miami region, Gulf Coast, and they just move slowly north. The scouts, or the adults rather, they're arriving week by week. They progress further north, and it's really fun to see how the migration is going. So again, visit that site. But the birds are wintering in South America. A lot of them go to Brazil, Venezuela, as far as Paraguay. Here is a neat little animation. So Cornell runs eBird. People submit all their data. And here you can see an annual pattern for similar to what's on the Purple Martin Conservation website. But here's birds heading north, doing their breeding. Now it's fall, and they're heading down to Brazil. So pretty cool stuff out there. And again, eBird, you can create an account and participate, or you can just go and browse and explore all the offerings. They have animated maps now, migration maps for over 100 species, I think. So it's, it's essentially crowdsourced data from bird watchers, and it's really cool stuff. And then I mentioned the hermit thrush that migrates out of its breeding area and into the southeast. So we've been studying this bird for the last 4 or 5 years, and I use this bird as a way to introduce some young people to doing research. I've been working with some teenagers for the last 10 years, and so I got them involved in this. And why the hermit thrush? This is the breeding range, so it's more of a boreal bird, and down into the Rockies and such. But it comes down through the Alleghenies and into Shenandoah, and it would historically stopped about the North Carolina line. It didn't breed further south than, say, Mount Rogers. But sometime in the late 70s, birds started showing up in our mountains, in North Carolina mountains, in the Southern Alps, and now they're a pretty common breeder out there. So about 5 years ago, colleagues were asking me to do a little bit of a focal study, because so many birds are declining or decreasing or shrinking in range, and here was one that was expanding. So we thought, well, let's get some information and figure out why that is. And it's also high elevation. It's above 4,500 feet in the spruce fir, and that's an area that'll be impacted by climate change for sure. So I took these kids up, these two had been working with me for several years, from the time they were 12 and 14, and they learned how to catch birds and tag them and do the studies. And so we went up and started in 2016 doing both radio telemetry, which is where we followed adults around to understand their local movements and how they use the area during the breeding season, as well as this one migration pattern. I'll just show you real quick our study area. So these are the Black Mountains, and this is Mount Mitchell right here. So the road out of Mount Mitchell down to the Blue Ridge Parkway. And then our study area then is about 2 miles south of Mount Mitchell. It's a ridge line that runs off the Blue Ridge Parkway. And it sits about 5,000 feet elevation. And there are a lot of hermit thrushes along here and all through the Blacks. And there they are. So again, I sent them out to catch the thrushes, they put radio transmitters on to follow them around, collect the data. This bird is the bird I'm going to show you a migration point on, because a path, and that's why they're smiling, because they We tagged it with a GPS tag in 2019, and they went back this last May and were able to recapture it and get the data. So it's pretty cool. So this is a hermit thrush with a radio transmitter on, just to show you what it looks like when they're wearing a transmitter with the antenna. And we do these color bands so we can identify individual birds without having to catch them again. The bird on the right has a GPS tag. So it's a 30-gram bird, which means 5% of that is 1.5. That's my limit. So a 1-gram tag fits just fine. It's well under the limit. Our transmitters or radio transmitters are also about 1 gram. We try to stay below the 5% limit, not stress the birds out too much. They are tied on with this jewelry cord thread. On the case of a GPS tag, this says we want this thing to survive about up to a year, whereas these transmitters, we only need them for about a month, and we use a much lighter thread that will rot and fall. The unit will fall off after a short amount of time. So what did we learn when we downloaded the data? All right, so we tagged 3 thrushes. In June of 2019, we went back in May, we got 1. We saw another, we couldn't catch it. And that's how it goes. So we programmed 8 points between September and April. We skipped January because we figured once the bird was where it was going to be in the winter, we didn't need to have, say, December. We figured it would be there by December, and we didn't need December, January, February, March, all in the same spot. So we put an extra point in September. We were told that 2 of our birds from 2016 had been seen on our study site on April 6th or 7th in 2017. Our colleagues told us, hey, we saw a couple of your birds. We didn't know they were back that early. We never get up there till mid-May. So we were glad to know that. So we programmed 1 point in early April. So this line is just showing you that in the last point of North Carolina is here, and then the next point that we got in November is here in southern Alabama. It's south of Montgomery. That's not to say that the bird flew a straight line. We don't know that. And maybe it did. Maybe it flew right over Atlanta, poor thing. But that, I'm going to zoom in. I'm going to zoom in up here to show you some points, and then we'll zoom in down here. So here we are up in our mountains. So we'll skip the April for now because we want to show you that this is where the bird's territory is. So that's our study area. That's the ridge. This is Mount Mitchell up here. The bird was occurring right south of the end of our trail. They caught him in 2016, as I was saying. They went back in 2019 and found him still there. Caught him, put the GPS tag on. After we got him back, download the data. So in September 10th, the bird had flown about a mile south-southwest. This is sort of the county line between Buncombe and Yancey and McDowell. So this is the Blue Ridge Parkway right here. It's a trail that goes all the way down to I-40. There's Montreat. And then a couple weeks later, the bird is over here, about a mile northeast. The next point we get this is October 21st. So it's still in North Carolina. It's October 21st, and here's Mount Mitchell. It's flown over the Black Mountains, over 60. So those are at 66, 80, almost 6,700 feet. We don't know if it went down the mountain, through the valley, up the other side, or just how it got there. But there it is, and then it takes off. So the next time we get a point is here. So it's about 5 miles northeast of Luverne. So again, we're south of Montgomery. It's along the highway here. It's somebody's little farm woodlot. It does not stay put. It flies 3 miles or moves 3 miles northwest to another little woodlot farm area. And then it moves again. So, we sort of misjudged. We thought that the bird would stay put by December. It did not. It moved southeast. But here, so we skipped January. We got a point in late February and mid-March, and there the bird has been hanging out for over a month on somebody else's little woodlot and on their farm. And then after that, like I said, it was amazing that we picked April 6th as the day to take a point, because lo and behold, our little guy has come back, and he's right on the Blue Ridge Parkway, but he's just about a quarter mile from his little territory here. So I'm sure by the next day, he was right back on his territory, which is similar to what our colleagues had told us they had seen back in 2017. So it's pretty interesting to be able to program these things, put it on a little songbird, and then if you get it back, download the data and see what this little guy's been up to some extent. I'm pretty fascinated by this. I never thought I'd live long enough to see this technology come around and be able to use it. Another bird that's up in our mountains, similar to the hermit thrush, is this northern saw-whet owl. In this case, they also occur down the Alleghenies into the southern Alps, but they're isolated populations, and we're particularly interested in birds that are isolated like this, especially up in the spruce fir. As I said, that habitat will be impacted in a likely negative way from a changing climate. So we don't really know what this little owl does. It's very nocturnal, so it's hard to study. It's hard to study nocturnal birds at all, let alone in the mountains. But now with GPS tags, we could get data on their foraging and other movements. And so that's the thing we hope to do. Our colleagues that helped us with the hermit thrush have been putting up owl boxes, so they got a few, and these gals have been trained to go out and put bands on them. But then next thing we want to try to do is put a GPS tag on these birds and get foraging data. This is a female, and she was in the box, and she does all the incubating and the brooding for the first couple of weeks, and the male does all the provisioning. He brings all the food to her while she's incubating and while the first couple of weeks after the eggs hatch. So he's the one we really want to tag. So we would have to be there at night to get him. He only comes around at night. But once we have a known nest box, we can do that. We can put the net up in front of the nest box and get a male, and then we'd be able to catch it again and get the data. Anyway, that's the plan. And then I had a student involved in studying golden-winged warbler, and I've worked with a colleague in Audubon, North Carolina. It's Curtis Malling, to study golden-winged warbler. And we've worked in Nicaragua, and he works in the mountains of North Carolina on this species. So I've worked in Nicaragua for about 15 years, and my student and I became part of this bigger international effort to learn more about golden-winged warblers on their non-breeding ground, and as well as during migration, because it's really declined precipitously in the last 20 years. The population numbers have really plummeted. So what did we do? I'm going to stop this if I can. I don't know if that will. All right, there we go. So we put geolocators on some birds. She did radio telemetry at a couple of coffee farms. That's where we're working on some sustainable coffee plantations where the warblers do spend the non-breeding season. But I'm just going to show you some geolocator information. So the two maps there that you're seeing are two birds that show how the bird moved up through the Yucatan and through the central US and into northern Wisconsin or eastern Minnesota. And so we did this as part of a collaboration with folks at Cornell and several other universities and several coffee farms. So we were part of a four groups of us, two in Nicaragua, one in Honduras, and one in Costa Rica. And the student was at Cornell, and she had us go out and tag as many birds as we could. And so my crew put geolocators on 20 warblers and then went back the next fall and got 5 of them back. And she got birds from Honduras, other part of Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. And she was able to show that all these birds are going up to the upper Midwest. And then I'm just going to let this animation play. That's a little bit spurious right there, that the bird has flown up in March. They don't do that. They actually don't start migrating north until spring, early May, but you'll see that happen here. So it's just an animation of one of the bird's data points flying up the central flyway. It's kind of cool to see. And then it hangs out like it should all through the spring, the summer. It's breeding. It does one interesting movement, interesting to me. I don't know what to make of it. It looks like a bit of a molt migration type thing where here it's late summer and it moves a little bit, but not a lot. And then it stops for a little bit. And then it moves a little bit more. And then it's not until September and actually moves back. If that's true, and then it finally heads south, then that implies that this bird did a molt migration, which is undocumented for golden-winged warbler. But that's the sort of thing that it could be happening, and there it's back in northern Nicaragua. So anyway, again, what she found is that of those 37 birds, all the data, again, it's a little bit fuzzy map because it's not, it's 50-mile accuracy, but the distribution of the bird during the breeding season was here in northern and central Wisconsin over to eastern and northeastern Minnesota. So all these birds in Central America their population is connected to the birds in the upper Midwest. So that helps us put the pieces together. And what Curtis and colleagues have done is tag birds here on the breeding ground in North Carolina, Virginia, I think Pennsylvania. And what they found is those birds were going to northern South America. So it seems like this species is doing a straight line migration. And again, they don't all do that, but in this case, it seems to be that that's what they're doing. That's a strategy. And then turkey vulture. I just like vultures, and so I wanted to see what vultures were up to, and what people were doing with vultures. And they've obviously done very well since the advent of automobiles, and people are putting satellite transmitters on them. You can go to another site called movebank.org. This is a colleague of mine at the museum, works with colleagues of his over in Germany. They put together this website for people like me to archive all of our animal movement data. And this site, you can go and explore this as well. So that's what I did. I went to look and see what people are doing with turkey vultures. And these are some biologists who are putting satellite transmitters on turkey vultures in a couple of different locations here in northern Pennsylvania, here in Saskatchewan. So that's kind of cool. Bird to see that this bird's flying all the way to South America, whereas this bird only went to South Florida. So here you can see up close, and you can really get accurate pinpoint location data on where these birds are going. And we can zoom in again. Here's a bird that was breeding up in northern Pennsylvania and then headed south. And it's kind of cool to think that I might have been looking up and watching vulture fly by at some point near Raleigh or near Durham, and that vulture might have had been wearing a satellite transmitter. That's cool stuff. Roland asked me one time about putting a cell phone tower transmitter on a large bird. I don't work with large birds, but I said, let's talk to the Raptor Center. And we did. And they had a bald eagle that was just ready to release. This was about 5 years ago. They put the unit on this eagle. And just this morning, I got another email, that I get a weekly email. This bird is still out there in eastern North Carolina. It's still out and about, but now it appears that it has found a mate. There's some movement data that implies that it has finally found a mate. It was a young bird when they released it, but this is some old data a couple of years ago. As a young bird, it was moving around. It spent time here near Virginia Beach. Then it flew up and spent time on south of Lake Erie. Then it came back. So again, it's pretty cool stuff. And again, you can explore all this over at movebank.org. I was involved with the Black-capped petrel international working group. This is a pelagic seabird, so the bird that feeds well offshore, off North Carolina. We see them anywhere from 50 to 70 miles, in part because that's where the fisher boats go, and we would go bird watching. And my previous boss did a lot of surveys off the coast. So here's North Carolina. Here's the outer continental shelf, and that's where he saw the birds foraging when he was doing his work. But what we know is the birds breed in Haiti. At the time, 20 years ago, it's the only known location where there are 2 or 3 locations in Haiti, which is kind of a desperate place to be as a breeding bird. Since we found some in the western part of the Dominican Republic, but still, this is an endangered bird. There are just a few thousand left. And they visit their burrows at night. So they nest in these burrows in forested areas. They dig burrows on the ground way up high in the mountains. They only come at night. Off North Carolina, when Dave was doing his surveys and a colleague out of Georgia was doing surveys in this part of the world, they combined their data, and this is seasonal data, to show you that the birds indeed were coming up at all months of the year. That's in part because when these birds are like the eagles or like albatross, they're related to albatross. It takes them several years before they're old enough to breed. So some of these are probably young birds hanging out all year. Others were surely moving, but we really didn't know what was going on. And now with technology, we can. So some folks at Clemson University were able to get some satellite units, and they were able to go offshore and catch a few birds using a ballistic net, catch some birds, and they put tags on 3 petrels. And this is pretty cool because, in fact, it's showing exactly what we thought. Birds are leaving here, the Haitian region or Dominican, and flying up, sure enough, just like my boss's observation showed. But what you could never know from observation and just cruising around on a small yacht out here, they birds are all over the place, which is what we expected. We knew there was a lot that we don't know. And what was really surprising, though, is that my boss was convinced that they only flew into the Western Atlantic because this continental shelf is where the rich nutrient-rich waters are. It's colder water, lots of things to eat. That's why the fishermen people go out there. That's why you have the whales and sea turtles that move up and down. Whereas the Caribbean waters are warm, less nutrient, and he thought there's no way the petrels are going there, but in fact they are going there. So again, that's why we do research to really figure out what's going on. So I was real surprised to see, just how many flights these two birds took all the way down to the northern coast of South America. But the yellowbird was also exploring. So it's pretty fascinating stuff. Here's a low-tech look at some data. Again, bird banding. So we've done a lot of work in the Piedmont, 2 sites, one at Prairie Ridge that the museum manages, and I work another site out by the zoo that's very similar to Prairie Ridge. And so we catch a lot of sparrows. And so I pulled data for the song sparrow. These are, the male and female look alike. The young birds look a lot like the adults. Can be hard to tell the ages apart. We can do it, but interesting to know just in general what is their movement pattern, annual pattern like, so on a yearly basis. So I pulled the data for 7 years, and Brian O'Shea at the museum has been doing visual aural surveys at Prairie Ridge for the last 7-8 years. We compared the data, and he said his pattern was pretty much the same as this. So this is the band data. Song sparrows, they don't breed much in the Piedmont, and so we don't catch many. But what you see is that they start to increase. These are probably young birds showing up since they've, fledged, and there are more of them. And then in October, you have this big pulse. And in fact, when you look closely at the data, it's the last 2 weeks of October. So this is interesting. And then it drops off to about half of what was in October, and it stays at that level through the winter. So we're getting this big influx the last 2 weeks of October. About half of them keep going south. They go somewhere else, and then probably about half stay. And that's an interesting thing for the people we work with that manage these lands to understand if they're wanting to do some burning or mowing. And a lot of people burn and mow, especially if you have meadows and prairies like we're working in. That's how you maintain it. It's with fire or a tractor. But it's good to know what impact you might be having. When we do this with a white-throated sparrow, what we find is that the peak is actually more, it starts in November and December. So they start showing up in October, they increase November, they increase in December, and they just kind of stay that way for a couple months. And then there's this big peak in March, which is interesting because remember that most young birds die before they reach their first full year. So by March, there should be many fewer birds. Why would we get a big increase in a sparrow migrating north in March? Well, something about its behavior, its trajectory, its migration path is causing it to want to be migrating over the eastern U.S. or and through the Piedmont of North Carolina. I mean, it may be that pattern in other places, and in North Carolina, I don't know of any other studies, but it's an interesting pattern that we get both at our 2 sites, our 2 Piedmont sites. So again, these are, it's nothing too fancy, but it's a nice way to get some really good data on something that land managers can use when they're managing their lands. So what's next? Well, it's kind of going crazy because that's what I call too much information, really. Now, my colleague Roland and working with his colleagues in Germany have designed some new satellite tags that are only 3.8 grams. All right, so that's amazing because up until now they were about 3 or 4 times heavier than that. So that meant larger birds like pigeons and things. We could not ever I just can't believe we now have a device that can fit a robin. But they have. So we have a little project designed to try to get some data on robins this winter. Again, we're limited to 5% of the weight, just to show you what we go through. So 3.8, so that gives us 76 gram. That's our lower limit. So when I catch a robin, we have to weigh it. And it turns out that around here in the breeding season, most of the robins are less than 76 grams. We have those data. But we also do banding all year round. And our winter robins, we get robins from different parts of their range, and there are these different populations. Just like I mentioned with orange crown warbler, there are different populations of robins, and the birds that come from up north are a little bit bigger, and they're over 76 grams. And so our project design is to catch birds in the winter when we know they're heavier, and they'll be able to wear this without any harm. And then we'll start to learn about robins, because we've also done, a number of us have done studies of mark and recapture with robin. And what we've learned is that they don't come back to the same spot. They're not like those white-throated sparrows that come to my backyard. I've banded robins in my yard for a few years and they don't come back. They come back somewhere nearby, but they don't come back to the same spot. And that's what other people have found. So this is a way that we'll be able to figure out a little bit more of just what makes a robin a robin. They're very mobile. They're very facile in the way they move around with weather fronts and figuring out where the wet ground is going to be. It's a fascinating species. And we're now going to be able to start getting some real insight into just what makes them do what they do. It's pretty fascinating stuff. So I mentioned these sites throughout the program, but it's just a summary. Maybe you can take a quick screenshot, but these are some great places to go and play around with the data that these sites offer up. All of them are just really fascinating places to go get really good, solid data. eBird, you can start at ebird.org and then poke around for different things and just move bank.org and then look for different species. So I encourage you to go explore, and one thing will lead to another. A lot of little rabbit holes out there. I guess they're petrel burrows. And so that's it. If you have any questions, Chris, I'll send it back to you. And stop sharing. Figure out how to stop sharing.
All right. Thanks, John. Absolutely fascinating stuff. So many interesting stories, so many interesting strategies that all these different birds are using. Like I wasn't even familiar with molt migrations.
No, yeah.
And that seems like a pretty interesting, at least I'm kind of interested in learning a little bit more about molt migrations, like why some species feel would want to molt before and then take off, or why they would wait to get someplace and then get their new feathers.
Well, you know, that question
or
of
just sprinkle
why.
feathers over all of North America.
You know, we often just don't know why, and we're always trying to just figure out what. So yeah, it's
Sure.
that's an interesting thing, that it may be that there's a molting is a pretty nutritionally intensive physiological process, so they need a lot of nutrition, and it may be that they have figured out that there are places to be that offer better food for getting through that molt quicker. You know, it's maybe,
Okay.
and I think that's the sort of thing that people are looking into.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Well, in the time we've got left, there's some good questions here. Aaron is asking, I was wondering about how migrations across species might be impacted by all the hurricanes we've had this year.
Well,
it's been an outsized year for major storms.
Yes, it has. And, you know, we presume that a lot of birds have evolved with storms. The black-capped petrel, my boss actually felt that their whole breeding season was, they don't start breeding until now, which is after the hurricane season. So imagine, you know, where they are in the Caribbean. They actually will start their breeding, their courtship starts in November. And so we think that, you know, birds are tuned to this, but they're episodic. And of course, they're historically, and I mean geologically, there didn't seem to be as many hurricanes as there are now. So I don't think we really know, but we have to presume that birds are impacted. There was one of those Wimbrels I mentioned that had the satellite tag. They have data of that bird got through that bird flew through or around or over one of the hurricanes. That bird had a satellite tag that was a few years ago, and it's at William and Mary, the College of William and Mary. They have the story of that bird. I think they called it Hope, and you can look up the story of Hope, and it actually navigated a hurricane, and I forget the details, but we feel like that our Swainson's warbler population that we were studying in South Carolina took a hit from the hurricanes one year. So that would be a local extinction event, but it was repopulated by other birds, because we had Swainson's warblers on our study site, but all the ones we had banded that should have been back weren't there. So that was all we could figure out, but we're still learning.
All right. Charlie is asking, do you usually get the data locators back by recapturing the birds in mist nets? And is this an effective way of getting data, or is it rare to recapture the tagged birds?
It depends on the species. And so, for example, with the golden wing warbler, they we now have some data that indicates they don't necessarily come back to the same spot. They come back close. They're sort of like the robin. They go back maybe to the same farm or maybe to a farm, 100 acres away. And then we don't know that because we're only working on one spot. And so, and also the golden wings are a little bit tricky to catch because they're in the canopy. They are territorial in the winter, by the way. Then even though they're non-breeding, they defend a territory. And that means we play their song and we get them. But they can be 100 feet up in the tree, and to drag them down, it was a lot of work. So the fact that we even got 5 was amazing. And I guess, is it the most efficient? It's really the only thing we have. It's not necessarily efficient, but, we all work for cheap because it's so exciting. So, and the technicians were getting paid even less. And so they, they were just thrilled to be part of it. And obviously satellite telemetry is more efficient because it's sending a signal to a satellite, and it's, a continuous, or with a small bird doing the MODIS tower. Once the towers are up, they're sending signals all the time. But when we have to get a unit back, it's physical labor. I'm sending young people out, or I'm out there myself, and we're walking up and down the mountain. We know the bird is around, but I tried I went on 2 trips up to the mountains to try to catch that one other thrush. So I spent 4 days doing it, 2 days on one trip and 2 days on another. I don't like to harass the bird too much because we're doing the playback and the bird flies around, and I don't want to keep doing that. I can't do it for more than 20 or 30 minutes at a time because he's got babies somewhere to feed, or a female he's watching over. So we don't want to harass him too much. So we do it for a little bit in the morning. We did it for a little bit in the afternoon. I did it over several days, and I never caught the bird. So, that's not exactly efficient, but it's what we have. Now, yes, we do use mist nets. That's how. I'll probably use a little, I have a little ground trap that's a walk-in trap, and I'll probably use that maybe next week or the week after for these there's this white-throated sparrow in my backyard, and I'd really like to know which one it is. It's just got a silver band with a 9-digit number. I know which one of 5 it is because I know the 5 we did, and I know what day that was, but I'd still like to know which one. So there's some walk-in traps I have that they since they feed on the ground, I'll just put the seed on the ground and put the trap on top, and it'll walk in and trigger the door. But mostly I use mist nets.
All right. Good stuff. Can I ask you about monarch butterflies?
Yeah.
So
Sure.
Kathy is saying, when I see a solitary monarch in the garden at this time of year, did it fail to migrate, and will it survive the winter?
So it's still migrating. There are some monarchs that linger into November, and they're still on their way. They're on their way south. And they, of course, will be the generation that overwinters, returns next year into the southern U.S. and lays the first generation of eggs and then dies. So that individual, if it were to stay here in the winter, I don't think it wouldn't survive, but it still has a chance. One of my student that did the golden wing warbler work in Nicaragua, she also worked on monarch tagging on the eastern shore of Virginia for a couple of fall seasons, and she said they would get monarchs. They would be tagging monarchs through the first week of November. I didn't realize that, but they're drifting down the East Coast still, so they still have a chance. Although it's awfully cold this week.
I was just about to say the last couple of weeks, I'd been noticing them in the plants around where I'm at. They've been coming to visit and feed. But yeah, it got cold.
Yeah, we had a big cold front, the other night, and I'm sure that pushed a bunch of them on, or it certainly is going to. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Marty wants to know, what's your favorite or most notable or unusual migratory bird find?
Wow, that's a good one. I guess really I have to say that little hermit thrush represents notable for me for multiple reasons. One, I mean, that's the first time it's been done on that species, and those, the one girl, the one girl in that picture up front left, she was 15 when, or she was 12 when she started working with me, 12 years old. She was 15, I guess, when I took her up to the mountains with the others. And in that photograph, she's like, 19. So she's been working with me all these years. And the others that were in there have been working with me a long time. They were the twin girls that were in that photo. They were 14 when they started, and they were part of that. They helped pull this whole project together as teenagers. And then that was quite the thing for them to go and get that bird and then to get the data to see, and just the level of information about that. It went down to this, one little farm, and then it flew to another little farm and another little farm. And, they were so excited, not only for that, but they were like, we're driving to Alabama this winter. We're going to go find that bird, and we're going to go talk to the people whose farms it went on. Because I thought, wouldn't that be a great thing to go like show people the map and to just say, look, this is what we learned. I'm sure some of those people will be like, what are you doing? And of course, COVID came along and ruined everything. But they were ready to get in the car and be these, be the ambassador for this bird, and to just show, what a kind of an interesting connection that is. These little woodlots make a difference for these birds. So far, I mean, I've obviously been involved in a lot of things, but that, for both those reasons, getting the young people involved, and then that one bird's data, pretty cool.
All right, the last one that's on the list here. This user is asking how the 5% threshold for the weight limit on the tags was determined.
Safety for the bird. You can study birds' behavior in captivity. So working with veterinarians or people in the zoo or live animal people with their cage birds, and people went and tried, and this was done not only in the U.S. but in Europe. And people just tried different weights on birds and just watched their behavior over and over and over, and determined the upper limit. And actually, the upper limit is more like 7%. But we don't want to kill the bird. I mean, we're trying to study its livelihood, and you also don't want to impact it too negatively, because then it's not going to behave normally. So, I weigh now about 150 pounds. And so, 5%, I mean, it's kind of like a bag of sugar, well, 1.5 bags of sugar that I would put on my back and carry that around. So you can try that at home. You can get a bag of sugar, flour, and put it on, wrap it around your belt and walk around for a day and see what it feels like. But that's kind of what they're going through. And we have a harness that's around their legs. It bugs them a little bit. So we just want it to be the least impact as possible. I mean, the good news is that all these birds I've tagged with radio transmitters, I usually am around 3 to 4%. A lot of people do 3 to 4%. And what we see is that the birds just keep breeding, they keep feeding the young, they keep doing what they were meant to do. So that's good news. That's the good thing. Especially when they come back the next year, then it all worked out okay.
All right. Will you make it down to Nicaragua this year?
No, in 2018, there was some major. So I got home in March of 2018, and in April there was a major political fallout. So there were some protests. There had been some proposed cuts to Social Security and other things, but there have been other political unrest. They were trying to build a canal, like the Panama Canal through Nicaragua, but it was very unpopular because they were condemning all the land and indigenous tribes and stuff. So there was a lot of unrest, and it exploded in April. And the government's response was to go out and start shooting these protesters. By July, 300 people had been killed. And I was also working in the tourism industry with, bringing eco-tours as well as doing research. By August, all the 90% of the tourism was done. People weren't going anymore, and it never recovered. It's never recovered, and there's still problems. And then when COVID hit, their response to COVID was a fabrication, of the U.S. or some other group. There's been this anti-U.S. stuff for a while, and so it's been a mess. And tourism still, nobody wants to go and risk it, and I'm certainly not ready to go. So And then the one farm that I was mostly working at, they couldn't keep going. They couldn't, so it's for sale. It's for sale. So they had a beautiful eco lodge and all these cabins and stuff. They still have the coffee going. It's still, I just saw a note they've harvested coffee, but they're selling it and getting out. I don't know when they'll recover, but the tourists still aren't going. It's kind of a mess. Unfortunately.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It's a shame. It's a shame.
The intersection of people and wildlife.
Yes, it's a real conundrum. And when you work in a country like that, you take a risk not only to your personal safety, but your whole like projects and career. You know, I spent 15 years training locals how to be nature guides, how to be tour guides, we taught the twin girls. I took them down one winter for 2 months. They speak Spanish and they taught English to the staff at the lodge. And they were, English is a big deal. You know, when you learn English, it opens up so many doors, and they were desperate to learn more English. And so those girls went and spent 7 weeks teaching them English. And I taught English, but I taught them how to use computers and GPS units and all this stuff, and brought them some things like a camera and binoculars. And then, and then it all, you know, gone just like that. I mean, just in 3 months, it was gone, which was a shock, definitely a shock. We never thought that would happen, but it is the risk you take. But you know, I mean, if I could do it again, I would, because I was helping them help themselves. You know, it was a job for them to be tour guides. They were making money off showing people how to watch birds and how to watch sloths and bats and things. You know, we'd go out and look at bats. I mean, they learned it all, and they were now tour guides getting paid to show people their nature. Natural resources. So yeah, I would do it again, but it's a risk for sure.
All right. Well, I'll call it there. John, thanks for being with us for today, talking to us about animal migrations.
Thanks for having me.
And everybody who's out there watching, thanks for joining us too, tuning into the Lunchtime Discovery series. You can follow and learn more about programs and events coming out of the Museum of Natural Sciences from the museum social media accounts. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All three, you can search for @Natural Sciences, and we should pop right up. You can also visit naturalsciences.org. Check out our virtual events to see more programming that's coming up. We have live events happening every week, all week long, and then lots of special events too, opportunities to learn and engage with us at the museum. If you want to know what's coming up for future Lunchtime Discovery programs, you can follow the Office of Environmental Education on Twitter. They're @North Carolina EE, and you can check out their website, eenorthcarolina.org, where you can get more information and sign up for their email list in order to know what programs are coming up in the future. From all of us at the museum, thanks to the Office of Environmental Education for helping put together the series, the digital team at the museum for helping us run the live stream, and again, to Dr. John Gerwin for being with us. Next Wednesday, if I have my dates right, we won't be with you for Lunchtime Discovery series, so we'll be back here Wednesday in 2 weeks. Take care, everybody. Stay safe.